UFC Vegas 67 betting and DraftKings show. We have 12 fights this Saturday. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. Kicking things off in the women's flyweight division, Sijara Eubanks comes in as a minus 230 favorite. The comeback on Priscilla Cachuera is plus 195. And this is an interesting matchup because on one hand, there's a lot of red flags and reasons why you can't trust Sijara Eubanks, especially at a chalk price tag now. I think early numbers like the opener at minus 140 or whatever, if you were able to snipe that, I think that was an excellent bet. But where it's at now, I have no interest in backing her on the money line. Even in a parlay, she's just tough to trust because for starters, she turns 38 years old in just a couple months here. She's always had a tough weight cut, her cardio issues. She's notoriously struggled with cardio over the course of her career, and now she's lost 4 of her last 5 fights. Now, the good news is this is actually a really good stylistic matchup for her against Priscilla Cachuera, who relies on her power and her durability. She will eat 2 punches and keep moving forward just to try to land that one big heavy punch. The thing is she just can't stop takedowns. She defends takedowns at only 65%. We know that her defensive grappling is simply not there. When she's taken down, she doesn't know how to work back to her feet. She doesn't know how to fend off submissions. She's been submitted 2 times in her career. She just doesn't really have any semblance of a ground game. So I could see this fight going one of 2 ways. I think what's more likely to happen is Eubanks takes her down, controls her, dominates her in the first round, potentially gets a finish in rounds 1 and round 2. This could look a lot like the Elise Reed fight where she finished her on the mat. That wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. But the worry with Eubanks is if she can't get that finish, she's going to gas out. And at the very least, we know Cachuera is going to be there for 15 minutes and she's going to be moving forward and swinging heavy. So she better get her out of there early, because if not, I actually think Cachuera takes over and finishes Eubanks late in this fight. So I think this is a possible live betting spot on Cachuera. Other than that, I'm not going to have anything pre-fight. And then in terms of DraftKings, I do favor the Eubanks side because I think the most likely outcome is she dominates the grappling and gets Cachuera out of there. But it's going to be sweaty because, like I said, if she doesn't, I think she's at a pretty big risk in being finished herself. So the official pick is Eubanks by submission, but I'm going to have exposure to both sides on DraftKings. Next up in the men's flyweight division, we have Charles Johnson coming in as a minus 340 favorite. The comeback on Jimmy the Brick Flick is plus 280. And this is one where Charles Johnson's not really a guy that I like to trust at such a big price tag. Stylistically, he's not really the type of fighter to cover such a big price tag. And really, I haven't thought that he's looked great in the UFC through his 2 fights. Of course, his debut came against Muhammad Mokaev. That's a tough spot, but he just didn't do anything, didn't show us anything. And then coming off a split decision win over Zhalgas Zhumagulov, who I believe I bet in that spot, and a lot of people thought Zhumagulov actually won that fight. So I think Charles Johnson, while he does have a good skill set, I just think he really hasn't proven it yet at the UFC level. And then on the flip side, Jimmy Flick is coming off of retirement. So, who knows what the training's been looking like. I know on Instagram, it seems like he has been in the gym a little bit, but coming off a layoff like that, especially retirement at a pretty young age, is kind of concerning. But in terms of the skill set, I do think he's a live underdog in this spot because I think he's not a great wrestler, but he is capable of landing takedowns. And where he is dangerous is that submission game. 14 of his 16 wins have come by submission. He, of course, pulled off the flying triangle submission in his UFC debut before retiring. I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility that he can pull off something like that here, even though it's against somebody with decent defensive grappling. Charles Johnson has never been submitted in his career, but there's always a first time for everything. And I think Jimmy Flick is at least going to go for it. So that's what piques my interest, at least on DraftKings, because you have Johnson, who's very expensive. And I already talked about, I don't really think he covers his price tag. I don't think he really covers it on DraftKings either. He basically has to get that first round knockout. And while it's possible, because Jimmy Flick's durability is not great, he's been knocked out like 3 or 4 times in his career. His durability's never been good, but I also just don't think Johnson does enough. And it's not like he has this massive power either. So if he's not going to get him out of there in round 1, I really don't think he's paying off that price tag. So I think for DraftKings, the most important thing is I'm looking for ceiling. And an underdog like Jimmy Flick, if he were to pull off the big upset, I think he breaks the slate. So naturally, my ownership on DraftKings is going to reflect that. Next up, we have another big favorite in Dan Argetta, minus 600 favorite. The comeback on UFC newcomer Nick Aguirre is plus 425. And Dan Argetta is another guy like we talked about with Johnson, where I don't feel comfortable backing him at a massive price tag, especially not at minus 600, but this is a great matchup for him. He was originally scheduled to fight Isaac Dolgarian, and Dolgarian came from a collegiate wrestling background, beat a bunch of bums on the regional scene, but seemed to be like an okay, interesting prospect. I still liked Argetta in that matchup, and Dolgarian pulled out. Now we're getting basically a budget version of Dolgarian. So why would I not expect Argetta to be fully prepared for this type of matchup? Aguirre is a wrestler, high school wrestling background, I believe, seems to run through his competition on the regional scene, but the level of competition, this is a massive step up for him. Even though I don't think Argetta is some stud prospect by any means, he is at least, the former bantamweight champ over in LFA, looked okay in his UFC debut against Damon Jackson. I know a lot didn't really happen there, but he did have some moments there. I just think the level of competition, the cardio, those things are going to massively favor Dan Argetta in this spot, and I think he gets his hand raised on Saturday. So Dan Argetta by decision, that's the official pick. And going along with basically the overall theme of this card, we have another big favorite that's generally not somebody that you want to trust. Alan Nascimento is a minus 330 favorite. The comeback on Carlos Hernandez is plus 275. We'll start on the Nascimento side. Now, he did come through as a sizable underdog against Jake Hadley, and I think that's why he's getting so much respect baked into this line. But let's not forget, this guy is not a stud prospect by any means. He's generally a guard player. Most of his wins have come by submission. He's got a solid ground game, but he's not super aggressive in pursuing it. He is willing to strike, and then he can be taken down. He can be controlled, and that's the worry with backing him as a big favorite here. And then on the Hernandez side, you look at Hernandez, he fought on Dana White's Contender Series against my guy Daniel Barez, won a split decision there. I thought Barez was robbed a little bit. Hernandez makes it to the UFC, fights Victor Altamirano. I bet him in that spot. He won a split decision there, but this guy generally just keeps fights close. Now, that's whether he's the favorite or he's a dog because of the way that he fights. He tries to avoid damage on the feet. He can be backed up against the fence. He can be taken down, but he's generally pretty good at working back to his feet. He's shown off some solid defensive grappling on the regional scene. He's never been submitted in his UFC career. So I just think this fight's going to play out closer than these odds suggest. You look at Nascimento, he's not a great round winner. His last three fights his last three decisions prior to that Hadley fight all ended by split. And I think that speaks to his fighting style. And then on the Hernandez side, I just mentioned he's coming off of back-to-back splits. So I just think this is one where it does go the full 15 minutes. It's going to be close. I don't hate taking a small stab on the underdog at a big number in Hernandez. I think it's more likely Nascimento wins. But again, I just don't think these odds reflect how close I think this fight plays out. In terms of DraftKings, I just don't really see a ceiling for either fighter. I'm naturally going to be more interested in the underdog for the price, but overall, I just think there's better fights to target on this slate. Next fight up in the bantamweight division, Javid Basharat comes in as a minus 340 favorite. The comeback on Mateus Mandanka is plus 280. And this is one where I think Basharat just has him covered everywhere. Basharat is a guy who I tried to fade with Tony Gravely in his last fight, and credit to him, hats off. He was kind of chirping back at me on Twitter a little bit because I put out a couple Tony Gravely tweets leading up to that fight, and he responded after he beat him. But nothing but respect for the performance he put on. He certainly earned that decision victory. He's a very well-rounded prospect. The striking is on point. He's got solid cardio, and the grappling, I think, is underrated as well. Now, on Mateus Mandanka's side, this is a guy who fought on last season of Dana White's Contender Series, so I did a pretty deep dive into him leading up to that fight against Ashiq Ajim, who I just think was a really tailor-made matchup for him. Ajim basically has no durability. We knew that coming in, so we didn't learn a lot about Mandanka in that spot. He basically hit him once or twice and put his lights out. So it was a nice finish, exciting, but it just didn't really tell us much about him. He's a 10-0 prospect fighting out of Brazil. 7 of his 10 wins have come inside the distance. All 7 of those have been inside the first round, but he does come from a Muay Thai striking background. He's a former training partner of Charles Oliveira, and he's a 2-time Jiu-Jitsu world champion. So the kid does have a solid skill set. And I think that's where I probably disagree with a lot of the market, because I think people are just portraying him as some complete bum who just got a cupcake matchup on Contender Series. I agree with the cupcake matchup, but I actually think he could make a little bit of noise at the lower levels of this division. Certainly not in this matchup, though, against Javid Basharat. So I think this is a spot where you look to fade him here, but then try to buy him low on the next matchup in the future for Mandanka. But in terms of this spot, I think Basharat absolutely rolls here. The only interest I have in the betting market is, unless you're going to parlay Basharat with some of these other people, but the prices are getting out of control this week, I think you look at either an under 2.5 near a pick'em price. I think that's interesting. You know, Mandanka, like I said, 7 of his fights have ended in the first round, and Basharat historically is known as a finisher. Most of his wins have come by finish as well. You look at Basharat inside the distance in the plus 140 range, something like that. I think all of those are probably the best way to attack this fight. And in terms of DraftKings, I'll have a little bit of exposure to Mandanka, but I just prefer some of the other underdogs that I mentioned previously to him. So give me Basharat by decision. Wouldn't be shocked by a finish, just not sure which method of victory, but I do think he gets his hand raised on Saturday. And next fight up in the lightweight division, we have one of the biggest favorites on the card, Mateusz Rebecci, a minus 740 favorite. The comeback on Nick Fiore is plus 540, and Rebecci's another guy that fought on this past season of Dana White Contender Series. He's actually one of my favorite fighters from that last season. Somebody asked me a couple months back, hey, who were your top 5 this season? And I know Pyfer was up there. I know Rebecci was up there. And I think one of the Bonfarin brothers as well. I can't remember the other two, but Rebecci was certainly in that mix. I think he was one of the more proven fighters we got last season, and he had a pretty tough test in that fight where he did have to go through a little bit of adversity, but he went back to his wheelhouse, which is his ground game. He comes from a high-level grappling background. He's got a very lengthy regional career. He's the former lightweight champion over in Fenn promotion, and on the feet, he's not terrible either. He's just a bit reckless, because basically what he's looking to do is duck and throw his big left hand, and he's willing to take chances in the pocket. Yes, he has the potential to get clipped and get hurt, but he's willing to take those chances because he's so confident in his ground game that if it does go to the ground, whether it's a knockdown or his opponent tries to take it there, he's more confident that he's the better grappler of the two. And I think that's the case here against Nick Fiore, who's basically a 6-0 prospect. All of his wins have come inside the first round. So he's basically another one of those front-running guys, hasn't been tested at this level, comes from the Renzo Gracie system. I believe he's a black belt. Most of his wins have come by submission, but I just think he's facing somebody that's just much more well-rounded on the mat, who's just fought much better level of competition as well. So even though he's one of the biggest favorite on the cards, I do feel confident Rebecci gets his hand raised here. And in terms of the DraftKings salary, he's my favorite spend up at 9,400 this week. I don't trust some of those other big favorites to pay off their price tag, like Charles Johnson that I talked about earlier. We'll get to Umar Nurmagomedov later in this card, but I think Rebecci, I'm more confident pays off that 94 above 9K price tag on DraftKings. So give me Rebecci by TKO. That's the official pick, and he's one of my favorite spends on DraftKings. Next up in the middleweight division, we have another fighter from this past season of Dana White Contender Series. Claudio Ribeiro comes in as the slightest favorite, minus 115. The comeback on Abdul Razak Al-Hassan is minus 105. And this is one of my favorite from an entertainment standpoint. I think this is one of my favorite fights of the night because you have two guys that have enormous power. We'll start on the Ribeiro side. This guy's a 10-2 prospect fighting out of Brazil. He doesn't have a ton of skill set. He's not the most technical guy on the feet, but he has massive power. In my Dana White Contender Series breakdown, I basically referred to him as the budget version of Francis Ngannou before the wrestling upside that we saw from Ngannou recently. But prior to that, I think this guy's the budget version of him, where he basically like closes his eyes and just wings looping hook shots. But if any of them connect, you're probably going to sleep, because that's how explosive and how much power this guy carries. And then on the Al-Hassan side, this guy has arguably just as much power. You know, all 11 of his wins have come by knockout, the majority of which have come inside the first round. And even though he turns 38 later this year, he's lost 4 of his last 5 fights. Those things aren't good, but I do think this is a good bounce back spot for him. You know, coming off the Buckley loss, I think Al-Hassan, like I said, can compete in the striking, has just as much finishing potential early, but I think also would have the advantage if he mixes in the rest of his game, because we've seen at times Al-Hassan go to his judo background, go to the takedowns, and I think he would have a pretty significant grappling edge over Ribeiro if he decides to choose that, game plan here, and I think he probably does. So I think there's value on him on the money line. I think he's a great play on DraftKings because they priced Ribeiro $400 cheaper. So I think the field is going to gravitate to the cheaper guy who's a slight favorite, who's coming off the recent knockout finish, whereas Al-Hassan has not looked great recently, and he's more expensive as the slight underdog. So for that reason, I just think you're going to get much more leverage backing the more expensive Al-Hassan, and that's who I think is going to win this fight. So Al-Hassan by TKO is the official pick, and he's my preferred play on DraftKings. Next up in the bantamweight division, Umar Nurmagomedov comes in as the biggest betting favorite on the card at minus 950. The comeback on Hani Barcelos is plus 650, and this is some heavy line movement in favor of Umar Nurmagomedov. He opened as a minus 200 favorite. Now he's as pricey as minus 1,000 favorite, and this isn't some complete bum that he's facing in Hani Barcelos. This is a respected UFC caliber fighter. Hani Barcelos coming off a win over Trevin Jones. He's a skilled kickboxer. He's got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well. Strong takedown defense at 93%. You know, these aren't things where you would expect him to be a minus 650 underdog, but here we are because Umar Nurmagomedov, I'm as big a fan as anybody. I think he's future champ material, but I still am not really fully believing that he should be a minus 1,000 in this spot. I do think he wins, but I think just fighting a guy like Barcelos, who's going to be able to limit a lot of what Umar likes to do in terms of the grappling. Now, it doesn't mean I don't think Umar's not going to have success there. I think on the feet, Umar's going to be able to maintain distance a lot better than Barcelos. You know, he's got those nonstop kicking attack. I think that's going to keep Barcelos at bay quite a bit. I think Barcelos is a guy who probably needs to move forward, get inside, make it a little bit dirty in this spot. And I don't think Umar's going to give him that chance. And I do think Umar is going to be able to have success even against a guy who does have solid takedown defense. I think Umar's the better grappler. I think he's going to be able to control him and beat him to the positions on the mat. So give me Umar by decision. That's the official pick. But again, when it comes to DraftKings, he's 9,300. I actually think Rebecci is a better play on DraftKings. I think there's other fighters in that range, whereas Umar, yes, I think he's got a solid floor, but I think if this fight goes the distance like I expect it to, and Barcelos, you know, doesn't just lay down like Nate Maness did and just try not to get subbed for 15 minutes and give up 2.5 rounds of control time, I'm not sure that the ceiling is quite there for Nurmagomedov. So that's where I think I'm going to get a little bit of leverage against the field because he is going to be one of the most popular fighters on the slate, if not the very most popular. So I'm looking to come underweight to the field, even though I think he wins. And next up, we have Ketlen Vieira coming in as a small favorite at minus 115. The comeback on Raquel Pennington is minus 105. And this is a fight that I have probably the least interest in terms of DraftKings on the entire card. Also the least interest in the betting market because I just don't see a case where you can make a really convincing case for either fighter in being a dominant round winner in this fight. I expect it to be a very competitive fight. I think Pennington probably has a slight boxing advantage where Vieira might have a little bit more power and certainly more potential to land takedowns. Pennington only defends at 63%. I think Vieira averages around 1.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. So I think that could be an edge for her. I think she might be able to have a couple bigger moments in terms of the striking, but she's not really a very good striker in general, and she has had cardio concerns in the past. I could see this also being Pennington holding Vieira against the fence for extended minutes. I just expect this to be a very close fight wherever it takes place. So that just screams a pass to me. I think it's lined appropriately. I slightly lean Vieira by decision just because I think maybe she can land a takedown or two that might be able to swing these close rounds, but I have zero interest on DraftKings. I'm not going to be betting this fight. Vieira by decision is the official pick. Next up, Punahil Soriano comes in as a minus 155 favorite. The comeback on Roman Kopylov is plus 135, and this is one that I likely will be betting. I like the Soriano side in this matchup. I think the way you want to target fighters against Soriano is if they're going to be able to implement the grappling, because I think they could have success in that area, and I think that's going to gas out Soriano at a much quicker rate, and that's really Soriano's biggest weakness is that cardio. But you see, going over the course of his career, most of the times when he's gassing, it's because he's being forced to grapple, whether it's offensively or defensively. Whenever he's grappling, either way, he's gonna gas out much, much faster. And that happens with a lot of fighters, but specifically, it seems to wear on him quite a bit. Now, on the feet, if you're gonna strike with this guy, he's extremely durable and he's extremely powerful. He's got that big left hand. 6 of his 9 wins have come by knockout. I favor him in the striking department against Roman Kopylov. Kopylov is a guy who started his career on the regional scene 8-0, 7 of his wins had come by knockout. So he was billed as this very skilled, talented fighter, striker with big power, and he does have big power. He came over in the UFC, lost to Carl Robertson back in 2019, got submitted in the 3rd round, and that's always been kind of his issue, is he struggles with the grapplers as well, but he also kind of struggles with the strikers because he's not a big volume guy. He just basically relies on that big power, and he has landed a couple big shots in the UFC. He landed a knockdown against Albert Duraev, who was entirely gassed in that fight, and he still couldn't put him away. So that was a red flag, even coming off a sizable layoff there. Now, he did get the finish and looked better against Alessio Di Chirico his last time out, so I do still think he's probably improving, but I think this is a tough matchup for him against Soriano. If you're going to stand and strike with this guy, I think Soriano's more durable, and I think there's an argument to be made that Soriano's more powerful as well. And I actually think Soriano could implement the wrestling. We've seen in the past him land a takedown or two. I think that's a pretty big edge for him here if he were to do that. So I just think he's a better striker, more durable. Cardio's kind of iffy, but that's okay. I'm willing to overlook it, because I think he has a wrestling edge as well if he were to start losing the striking, which I don't even expect to begin with. So give me Soriano by TKO. That's the official pick, and I feel pretty confident about him this week on DraftKings. Next up in the co-main event, we have Dan Ige coming in as a -125 favorite. The comeback on Damon Jackson is +105, and I like the underdog here in Damon Jackson. He's coming off that finish against Pat Sabatini. Obviously, some unfortunate injury in that fight, but he is currently on a 4-fight win streak. Now, the level of competition, there's a massive gap in terms of what Dan Ige has been facing, but Jackson has been able to do what he needs to do, and he's fought a smart game plan in most of those fights. He's not a great striker, but he knows he needs to get the fight to the ground. 15 of his 22 wins have come by submission. He averages over 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. I think that's going to be the path to victory for him here against Dan Ige, who we've seen implement the wrestling at times when he has the wrestling advantage. But on the flip side, he's shown he can be taken down and controlled by better grapplers. And I think Jackson is the better grappler here. I think he has more potential to control where this fight takes place, because if he doesn't and this stays striking, I do think Ige's the much better boxer. But I'd favor Ige if this were 5 rounds. In 3 rounds, I think Jackson will be able to take him down multiple times, control him for a couple minutes here, and just really stick to him to at least win 2 of the 3 rounds here. So give me Jackson as the underdog. That's the official pick, which brings us to our main event. Now, this was originally supposed to be Nasruddin Imavov against Kelvin Gastelum. Gastelum had to pull out at the beginning of this week, and we have Sean Strickland stepping in on short notice. Of course, Sean Strickland coming off the main event split decision loss against Jared Cannonier just 4 weeks ago on our last UFC card. Now he's taking this fight on just a week's notice. The fight's going to take place at 205, so he doesn't have to cut weight here. And this is a very interesting matchup. There's been a lot of love since these betting lines open for Sean Strickland, and I get it to a degree, but I also think that this could play out pretty similarly to that Jared Cannonier fight, because you have Imavov, who I think is not going to be throwing or landing as much volume as Sean Strickland on the feet, but I think he has the potential to have the bigger moments. I also favor Imavov's durability as well. You know, we've seen Sean Strickland finish before, most recently against Alex Pereira. That knockout was not great. And then in terms of the striking, I think Strickland is he's going to be able to win minutes, but I also just think he's not impressing the judges. And that's what we saw in the Cannonier fight. It's like, yeah, he's landing more volume, but it's so lackadaisical, and he's not really having those big moments, whereas Imavov could get inside, land some of those big nasty elbows, and I actually think Imavov is the more likely of the two to land a takedown or two if he needs to. He's very big for the division, has explosive power, 5 knockouts on his record. I think Imavov is just coming into his own a little bit, and I don't like Strickland taking this fight on short notice coming off that loss. I think he's basically just going to treat this like a typical sparring match, as he typically does, and I think Imavov is the one that's going to get the better of that. So give me Imavov by decision. That's the official pick. But when it comes to DraftKings, they completely botched this price because they have Sean Strickland at just 7,700 and Imavov at 8,700. So everybody is going to play Sean Strickland. He's very cheap. He's pick 'em right now. You know, he was a slight favorite previously. So, I mean, he's basically a shoe-in in terms of cash games. And again, going back to the leverage in tournaments, that's going to take away ownership from Imavov because everybody's going to want to plug in that cheap value in the main event on the Strickland side. So it's not that Imavov's going to be low owned, but it is going to take a chunk of ownership than what it would be if these guys were priced appropriately in the 8K, 8,200 range. So just keep that in mind when constructing your lineups this weekend. And as always, you can check out fightnumbers.com where I'll have DraftKings player rankings broken down by salary tier. I'll have ownership projections as well, MMA line movement page, fantasy points per minute. It's all completely free. Check it out, fightnumbers.com. As always, thanks for watching. Best of luck, and we'll see you guys next time.